Hello everyone, my name's Cameron Tinker. I am going to do a presentation on the CSS Box model for my CIT 230 class and explain why the CSS Box model is so important when you're designing web pages and how it will help you to organize your HTML elements in such a way so that it looks pleasing to people that visit the site, it's nice and organized, and how you can get your designs to look, I guess, good for those that come and visit your site. So what is the box model? All HTML elements can be thought of as a box. So that means that each paragraph tag or H1 tag or header or article or whichever elements or tags that you're using can really be thought of as a box, either square or usually a rectangle of some sort. And each one of those boxes contains something. So when you put something in between two paragraph tags, an opening tag and a closing tag, that's the content of that tag. And a web page is made up of many of those elements or those boxes, either stacked on top of each other, or sometimes boxes are put within each other, like when you put a paragraph element inside of a header element, for example. CSS, as I mentioned earlier, is able to style each of those boxes. It can style the content within the box, change the color text or the font size or font family that you're using, and it can also arrange those boxes on the page so that it's well organized and aesthetically pleasing. This right here is the box model. Here in the middle, you've got the content of whatever's in that box, and in that content there can be other boxes as well, which I'll get into more later. And surrounding the content, you have padding, which is, it can be white space around whatever content that you're styling, but as we'll talk about later, it also contains other elements from what you're styling. And then there's the border, this one right here. It's the border that you can put around your padding and whatever content is in this element. And then your margin, which is your white space outside. So the content box over here, this box holds the contents of your HTML elements, like I explained before. Say you put a quote inside of quote tags inside of your header element, then that content would be inside of those quote tags, the opening and closing tag, which would then be inside your header tag. And whatever styles you apply to your content will show up in that box, the one that's in yellow there on the right. And each HTML element in a box is in a box like this entire box model and can be layered inside of each other. The second box, like I explained earlier, is for padding. It's the space around the content that lies between the content box and the border box. So your border will be around whatever content plus padding that you have for that element. Background colors typically will also be behind your padding as well as your content. So if you apply a background color to an element, then that applies to the padding as well. And you can add padding to all of the sides of your content by just using the padding property, or you can specify where you want it to be by using padding dash left or padding dash right, and then however much padding you want to use. You can use pixels or EM or percentages or however you want to organize it. And it's the same with all of these other elements as well, the border and the margin. So the border box, that's for the border. There's many different styles of borders that you can use. You can use a solid border, like what's surrounding that border box right now. You can use a dashed border. You can set different sizes for the border. So you could actually make the border quite large and quite thick if you want it to be. And then this last one, which I'll talk more about here in a minute, is the margin box, which can be kind of tricky to work with sometimes if you don't understand how it can work. It's the white space around everything else. So say you have a box that has a border around it, and you want space between that border and whatever other elements you have outside of that. This will add space there for you. And if you apply a background color to an element, it won't apply to the margin, but I'll talk more about that here in a minute. Let's take a look at some examples. Here's my website that I designed for this class. There's me. You can see my picture. That content right there that my name is in, that's within the h1 tag, or h1 element. And that blue area there outside of it is the padding that's between the content, the h1 element, and the border that surrounds it. And notice that the background color is the same. And this is the border. Obviously you can see that green outline around everything. It contains the content and the padding if you choose to use a border. And then this white space is the margin outside of that border. And it doesn't typically keep the background color of whatever it is that you're styling. And here's a little bit more about margins. If you're going to use cool borders and background colors like I have in my design to the right here, there's a line of code that you can use for CSS3. That asterisk there means that this is applying to every element. And then you set the margin to 0 so it doesn't mess with other things within your design. And then the box sizing property, you can use the border box assignment for that. And it sets, it's new with CSS3. It wasn't there for CSS2. And it makes everything so that if you set a container, say you use CSS to set your header to be 300 pixels wide, it will be exactly 300 pixels wide, including the padding, border, and margin. Whereas in CSS2, if you set it to be 300 pixels wide, it would be 300 pixels plus the padding, plus the border, plus the margin. So say if you had 25 pixels of padding, plus a 5 pixel border, plus 25 pixels of margin, it would actually be 355 pixels wide instead of 300. You might be thinking, after you try this out, you're like, wait, I added margins, but the borders and the background color are still applying to that. There is a loophole. Let's say that you have your code formatted like the picture to the right, which is how I'm formatting the header, footer, and h1 tags in my website. So under h1, you'll see that there's the font size that's defined to be 36 pixels. I've got the color of the text. I've got it aligned to be centered. And then I set the width of the container and the padding around it. So let's say that you decide that you're going to add a 25 pixel margin to the h1 element. What happens? So as you can see up here at the top, I've added, or this is the website as it is currently, and that's what it looks like there on the left. And then there on the left I've added a 25 pixel margin. And you can see that it's acting a lot like padding around the h1 element, where the background color is still there and it basically just whitened everything. So why didn't it add white space, or why is the border and everything still there? So if you look carefully at the code here, you're adding margins to the h1 element, but the padding, border, and background color are defined in the heading element, or the header element. That means that if you add margins to the element within the element, this is where it gets confusing, which contains the border and background color, the margin will also be within that element. Just think of it as a box model within a box model. So you've got that h1 element there, which is also a box model. It has its content, padding, border, and margin. And then that is inside of the header element. And the header element is what defines the background color and the border, so that anything within the h1 element is styled this same way and falls within those parameters. And that's how that works, which is where margins get a bit confusing. And this is what happens when you add margins to the container that has the background color and the border. So here's my site again here on the left. Looks good. Margins and padding and everything looks right. And then here is what happens when you add margins to the header and the footer. As you can see, I've added 25 pixels of margin. You can see that everything's now disconnected. I've got the box up at the top that's the header. And as you can see, I only added borders to the left and right sides of the main element, or main tag, but I don't have that there on the right that you can see. And then there's the the footer, which also has the same box. And the margins have disconnected it from the main tag or main element that contains all that other information. And that pretty much concludes the presentation. Hopefully you've learned something about the CSS box model and how it will help you to style your websites and arrange the boxes for each HTML element so that they work well together. And here's my sources if you want to go and check any of this. Highly recommend the W3 Schools, or W3C as it's called. There's a lot of content there about how to style with CSS to get your website to look the way that you want. Thanks for watching, and hope you have a great rest of your day.